How to deal with someone in an advanced conversational hypnosis session who talks a lot. One of the common problems with advanced conversational hypnosis is directly tied to one of its main benefits because it is such a conversational approach to change work, because we are trying to do so little. We are allowing the session to unfold itself. It can feel like it goes off the rails sometimes if the client is rambling, if the client is talking for talking's sake. It can become difficult to know what to do. So I want to give you 5 different pieces of advice that you can use to deal with that rambling client. Number 1 is you need to start thinking through the category of, is what they're saying relevant or not relevant to the context? And typically, my rule of thumb is every person is allowed to ramble for one session, or they're allowed to ramble at least for the beginning of the first session, because oftentimes just genuinely being heard is a deeply healing process for people. There are so few people who listen without trying to insert advice, without trying to insert tons and tons of alternate viewpoints, like just letting someone finally get the entire thing off their chest. What it can feel like for a client is you have this story that's been in your head, and it's this big, long, intricate story, and you've only ever been able to get out 80% of it to any one person. And finally just being able to tell one person the entirety of it and have them listen, asking good questions around it, is incredibly healing. Now, if you're going to do this route, you need to recognize that you still want to be paying attention to unconscious moments as they pop up. Ask questions about that part. That can help steer that rambling to make sure that it is relevant. But then if it's not, if you notice that it's just a lot of consciousness, a lot of rambling, and it doesn't seem to even be directly related to even their story and their conception of how this all fits together, that is when you want to interrupt them more. That's when you want to say, hey, I'd love to talk about that at another point, but what I'm really curious about is this, and bring them back to a topic within their previous rambling that had some unconsciousness to it, that felt more significant. The second piece of advice that I have is to include the chaos in your questions. So sometimes what this can look like is someone will keep bouncing back and forth between a handful of ideas. They might say, I want to stop smoking. And then as soon as you try to go down that route, they jump to a second thing. And then as soon as you try to go down that route, they jump to a third. And so what this might look like is, I want to stop smoking. You ask them a follow-up question like, okay, well, what makes you feel like you can't stop smoking? Well, it's not really about the smoking. It's more so about the fact that work has just been so hard. It's like, okay, well, what about work has been so hard? Well, it's not really about that. It's just that nobody really understands what it's like to be me. And so at this point, there's a couple of different ways you can try to keep them to actually go down one path instead of trying to constantly spread out. And that, in my mind, is a form of rambling, where it's like, you can't stick to one topic. It's always jumping all over the place. And then typically, I gave a shortened version of this. Typically, they'd say those things and then start on a whole new thing. So it's like they're spinning like crazy right on the surface of an area. And then as soon as you start to go deep, they just start spinning over here. And so there's a couple different options you have when this is happening. One is you can try to isolate them. You can say, okay, we have limited time today. We have limited progress perhaps that we can make today. Which of these 3 areas is most important to you? If we could only work on one and make real progress on it, do you want to talk about the smoking? Do you want to talk about the work? Or do you want to talk about the fact that nobody understands you? Which one is most important? That can help to at least create a context. Another thing that you can do is to just include the whole thing in your questions so they feel validated. And so what this might sound like, what this might look like is, and I understand that you want to quit smoking, but one of the hard things about that is it's not just about that, it's also about the work. And even in both of those contexts, when it comes to smoking, when it comes to work, probably when it comes to other things too, it feels like nobody understands you. So when you think about how nobody understands you, when you think about how work is so difficult, when you think about all the things with smoking, what do you feel like is really stopping you from making the change you need to make? And so what I did there was I took their rambling and I included it all in the question. And so if their brain has been using these things to kind of spin off in different directions to avoid going deeper, now there's kind of nowhere else for them to run because I've included all of it in the question. The third thing that you can do is what I call monologuing around their unconscious moments. So let's say that in the course of a conversation, You're going back and forth. You see unconscious moments. You are trying to use process instructions around them. You're trying to ask follow-up questions around those unconscious moments. But they keep finding ways to keep rambling about other stuff. They're just not slowing down enough. One of the things that you can do is once you've gotten a handful of good, juicy, unconscious moments, you can start to just talk nonsense and incorporate those ideas in it. And this is very difficult to demonstrate without actually having a real example, but I'm going to explain it kind of mechanically. Let's say that over the course of 15 minutes of them rambling, you have the phrase, "I just don't know what to do." And that phrase, when they said it, there was a lot of unconsciousness to it. Let's say the second unconscious moment that stood out was when they thought about their past, when they thought about their past experience as a kid in school. And then the third thing could be their father's approval. So I don't know what to do, experience in school, and the father's approval. So these three things on their own stimulated some unconsciousness. What you can do is just monologue, ramble, and I'll sometimes do it in the form of questions technically, but I'm going to keep rambling myself, but keeping it around these 3 points so that they aren't able to escape, so that they're having to kind of slow down. And I often just do it in a form of very long sentences. So something like, well, when you think about the fact that, everything that happened with your father and all those moments in school and how you just don't know right now, like, I wonder, what is that like for you? Yeah, what is that like for you right now, not knowing, especially when you think about everything that you felt with your father and with those moments in school? Because the interesting thing about being in school as a kid, especially having the experience that you did with your father, is that it often leads people to later in their life just not knowing how they want to approach things in life. And so I'm curious, as I bring all this back up, the not knowing, your father, the school, what is coming up for you right now? And so what I'm doing with that is I'm kind of combining the last strategy in a way, where I'm including the whole context, I'm emphasizing the unconscious moments within that context, but then with my speech, something that I've been doing kind of this whole time is I'm starting at their level of intensity, but then I'm also slowing things down. The fourth strategy that you can use is ask them why they're telling you. It can be a little bit blunt, but at a certain point, especially if they start to repeat themselves, I'll be like, yeah, it's interesting. You had told me that a couple times on this call already. I'm curious, why do you feel like that's important to keep telling me? And this can help them become aware of the fact that they're just repeating themselves. There can be a little bit of embarrassment, and you can even directly follow up by asking, do you feel like you're avoiding other topics by coming back to this one? Sometimes what can surface is they just have a belief that if they talk about it enough, it will fix itself on its own. At which point you can ask them how well that has gone for them. Because typically if they're rambling to you, they're going to be rambling to other people. If they have this story this well grooved in their mind that they're able to just say the whole thing at the drop of a hat, then likely this is a universal strategy that they're using. And so ask them at that point how well it's been working. Ask them if they feel like it's really made much progress. You can ask them, like, what do you feel like it's doing to you now by just repeating the story all the time? And then you want to suggest that, perhaps it's time we try a different approach. Tell them that you want to do something different. Would it be helpful to try a different approach to talking about this issue? Instead of highlighting all these details multiple times, what if we really slow down and approach this from a different angle? And then that is the fifth tip, is just slow everything down. You can tell them to slow down. You can say like, hey, I think that there are a lot of important details that we're missing by moving so quickly through the story. You can do some pacing and leading just by your own questions being really slow. And sometimes you have to catch them though. So you might need to start fast, interrupt them, be like, yeah, I completely understand everything that's going on with your father, everything about not knowing, etc., etc. But what I'm genuinely so curious about is not just that question, but this one. And just be dramatic with how slow you're willing to talk. to kind of make it clear to their mind, like, oh, we're slowing things down here. And so there's more that could be said. This is much more of an art than a science, but oftentimes it is helpful to slow down these types of sessions. Every now and then, it is good and helpful to let them rant, especially if you are seeing real emotion, real unconscious moments as they're doing it. But if you can tell that you're getting into the territory where they've repeated the story a million times, you can question how useful that's been, you can monologue around their unconscious moments, and then you can include the whole thing within the context of your questions so that it feels more validated while still getting them to slow down.